What's up, guys, and welcome back to our second week of our Acta Non Verba series. Last week, we looked at the passage from 1 John 3 that challenged us to love with our actions and not just with our mouths, our words, right? The world is tired of seeing Christians say one thing and then do something else altogether. They're fed up with the hypocrisy, and guys, honestly, they have every right to be fed up with it. That's not the model that Jesus showed us or the life that he called us to live. So we are working through a good bit of 1 John 3 last week. Our theme verse for this entire series is 1 John 3:18, where we read, "Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth." Guys, in your small groups last week, you talked about two ways that you were loving well in your actions currently. We also talked about two ways that we could do a better job of loving other people through our actions. And hopefully, you guys came up with some really good ideas for those opportunities that were being missed. Tonight, though, we're going to look at a story that you might be familiar with from the Old Testament. You might know some of the story, or you might have even heard the names that are in our story tonight, but it might be the first time too. Either way, this person shows us a great example of loving in action and not just in word. And if I say the name Nehemiah, what would come to mind for you? Probably a wall, right? Maybe the name Xerxes as well, if you've read the story before. Nehemiah's life is a great example of leadership and of loving in action. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of backstory before we look at some of the passages from his book. Nehemiah's book starts in Persia around 444 BC. Nehemiah was a Jewish man living in captivity in Babylon, but he had a very special role in his society. He was the cupbearer for the king. Now, this job had a lot of privilege, probably because it had a lot of risk associated with it as well. Nehemiah would prepare, he would test, and he would bring the drinks to the king throughout the day in the court. Now, the testing part is where it kind of got sketchy, right? Nehemiah would make sure that the drinks, whatever they were, hadn't been poisoned by some foreign assassin trying to overthrow the rule, right? This position gave Nehemiah, a foreigner himself, almost unlimited access to the royal court and even to Xerxes himself. Now, Nehemiah was just an average person. Keep that in mind. He wasn't a religious leader. He wasn't a great scholar. He wasn't a prophet. He was just in the right place at the right time for God to use him in a very mighty way. So let's turn to Nehemiah chapter 1 through 3, where we read, "The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire." Now, people would come into the king's court all day long and give reports to the land and ask for things, places that were under Persia's control. And as some Jews came and talked with Xerxes, Nehemiah asked them about the Jews that had made their way back to Jerusalem since the exile. There were two main movements, of people before this time. And so there was a solid number of Jews that had moved back to Jerusalem out of Babylon. But when asked how they were doing, Nehemiah got a really bad report. The people were struggling, right? The wall was broken down. The gates were destroyed. The people living in the city, they were unprotected from their enemies. And honestly, there were a lot of enemies to Israel at this point in time. So Nehemiah was upset by this report. In chapter 1, verse 4, he tells the reader that immediately he sat down and wept for days. He started fasting and praying to God for some answers. And already we see a lot of maturity in the person of Nehemiah. He recognized that the help the people needed would only come from God's hands. So he immediately went to God for answers. It's clear that Nehemiah had a love for his people, and his heart was broken over the state of Jerusalem and the people that were trying to live there. And this is where we figure out what it means to love in action and not just in word. Now, Nehemiah, he had already done more than a lot for the people might have in this other situation, right? Others might not have been so giving. He was living a very comfortable life with a lot of privilege and a lot of power in Persia. And if he was going to be hypocritical and love only in words, this book would have been only like a chapter long, right? Instead of mourning and crying out to God, Nehemiah would have just had responded to those men that came and gave the report with too bad, or maybe that stinks. But he didn't, right? Which gives us hope in this story. What What were his options? Think through it. He could have ignored the whole situation and lived comfortably in Persia. He could have mentioned it to someone in the royal court, possibly as an area in the kingdom that needed some attention. He could have possibly even tried to bring it up to Xerxes himself, which truthfully could have possibly cost him his position or even his life. Were there other options for Nehemiah anywhere in there? Let's turn to Nehemiah 2, 1-5 and read the way that Nehemiah loved through his actions and not just through his words. All right, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, he took up the wine and gave it to the king. And now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart." Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What are you requesting?" So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it." Now Nehemiah's response to prayerfully put it all on the line, he asked the king for permission to rebuild Jerusalem. Guys, this is a huge risk for his own safety, right? Scripture tells us that he went back to God several different times after he heard the initial news before settling on the course of action that he took. In the end, this was the only way that Nehemiah could see to get the city rebuilt and his people safe. Instead of his own comfort, he thought of the safety of others and their well-being. Xerxes his immediate question, his next thought was, "How long would you be gone? And when would you be back?" That speaks volumes to how important Nehemiah was to Xerxes and also to the level of trust that Nehemiah had developed between him and Xerxes. In fact, he actually allowed Nehemiah to use lumber from the royal forest to rebuild those walls, gates, and doors of Jerusalem. And guys, this was unheard of, and it infuriated the enemies of Israel that were around Jerusalem. They were used to being able to just kind of take supplies from a poorly defended people, scattered all over the place. And when the walls were fixed and the people brought together, they wouldn't be able to take advantage of the people like that anymore. They were going to lose that source of resources. So if you take the time to read the rest of Nehemiah, you're going to read some really cool stories of how God provided for his people, how Nehemiah was just an outstanding leader at this time in history, and how the people rallied together to accomplish a task that nobody thought they could finish on time. Another awesome part of the story is that after the walls were rebuilt, Nehemiah and a prophet named Ezra rebuilt the faith of the people by sparking a revival in the hearts of the people in the city, right? They tore down all sorts of false idols and turned the people's worship back to the one true God who had done so much for them. They restored the priority of the law to the lives of the people, and God blessed their efforts for it. Nehemiah had several options in front of him when presented with the fallen state of Jerusalem. He chose to love through actions and not just words. Nehemiah, he gave up his position in the royal court and he put in the insanely hard work of rebuilding the city walls and the faith of the people as well. He overcame logistical issues that came up, enemy neighbors that were always trying to sabotage things, even laziness and grumbling in the own people to accomplish the task that God had given him. Words would have failed long before the wall was finished. It took a leader of action, and that's exactly what God had prepared Nehemiah for in his service. This exact time and this exact mission. So, my question, what time and what mission is God preparing you for? The takeaway I get from this part of Nehemiah's amazing story is to do right when it needs to be done. Right? That's one way that we can love through our actions. You guys know those moments that happen. You know what I'm talking about, right? When something is happening that isn't right and we have this internal struggle as Christians. Do we say something? Do we stop it? Do we stand up for our faith? Or do we just kind of blend in? It's easier to just ignore the issue and fade back into the crowd, but is that the loving thing to do? No. When we step up, people are going to judge us, right? They're going to make fun of us. We don't want to deal with that. They might even start persecuting us because of our faith, because of that stand. but we still have to do what is right when we're presented with the opportunity. Nehemiah didn't just sit in the court as his people were suffering back in fallen Jerusalem. He rolled up his sleeves, got his hands dirty, fixing the problem that was before him. And guys, we can do the same thing. I'm sure you guys could all give me several examples from school just today of times when wrong things happened to people around you, but did anyone step up? James 4:17 gives us a very hard message. And it tells us that if we know the right thing to do and we fail to do it, we have sinned. And that is an incredibly hard thing to live out at any age. But that kind of integrity is love in action. That kind of integrity will change culture, and it's going to honor God as well. Are you ready to love in action like Nehemiah? I can't wait to hear what happens in your small group discussions. Guys, we'll see you all real soon.